Welcome to DIYEasyCrafts.com, how to make a cleaver. Now this is designed as a pretty easy knife making project. This particular cleaver was made from a waterjet cut blank, and then we added a lot of detail with etching. We etched the spine of the cleaver with a nautical type of anchor chain. I put an anchor end chain on one side of the blade and a sea turtle on the other side of the blade. A couple photos of the finished product. Used walnut scales or handles and brass bolsters. This project actually started with blanks cut on a waterjet machine. We used a company called Long Island Waterjet, located in Bohemia, Long Island, New York. They did a great job. I actually have these in stock. They're available on DIYEasyCrafts.com. But if there are any knife makers out there that want to have production runs made, I highly recommend Long Island Waterjet. These blanks are all cut out of 1095 high carbon steel. They're 3/16 thick, so that's a nice, heavy, meaty feel to it. And this, again, is a fairly easy knife making project. Now I say that because there's no plunge cut on the bevel grinding. So you could actually do this on a belt sander from Home Depot, on a 4-inch belt sander. I'm using a bevel jig, and that's just a piece of angle iron. I clamp the blade or the blank onto that. That piece of angle iron has a threaded hole in it with a bolt. So I can adjust that bolt to determine the angle of which I'm going to grind the bevel. And then basically all I do is I drag that blade blank across I'm using a 2-inch 2x72 belt sander in order to start cutting or grinding that bevel. And before I did this, I marked the edge of the blade, the center line. You don't want to come all the way in and have both sides meet. You want to leave, a 32nd of an inch or so, and then do the final sharpening after heat treating. Just a different view of the sanding. And in between each pass or so on the belt sander, I am taking this entire jig and dipping it in water just to cool off that blade. Depending on the type of sander you use and the speed and the grit of the paper, it does build up heat pretty quickly. But in either case, grinding or sanding these bevels is not very difficult when you use a jig and you use a belt sander. So this is the finished bevels, and I would of course do that on both sides. Then I brought it to my friend's shop for heat treating, and he just used a torch. He heats up the blade until it is cherry red and non-magnetic, and at that point you quench it in oil. I have a separate video on heat treating. I'll put a link to it on here. You can check that out. And after it's heat treated, I repolish it just with a 800 grit sandpaper, and then I temper it. And by tempering, I mean that I get rid of how brittle the blade would be. I put it in a regular oven, 375, for about 3 hours, and then I leave it in the oven without opening the door, usually overnight, until it cools very, very slowly. At this point, you're able to work on the embellishments to the blade. The basic blade is finished. You could just mount wooden scales or handles and you could be done. I decided to add some brass guards or brass bolsters. I attached these with 2-part epoxy and 1/8 diameter brass pins, and I just used the belt sander to trim off the excess length of the pins and a little Dremel grinder to start to form fit those bolsters to the shape of the blade. Now, because I'm planning spine etching, I am going to not only finish the bolsters, grind those even with the top of the blade, but I'm also going to have to mount the scales and grind the scales almost to the perfect size before I mount them, because once the scales and the bolsters are mounted and the etching is done, especially on the spine, I'm no longer going to be able to sand or adjust the shape of those scales. Normally, on most knives that don't have spine etching, I would mount oversized scales and then grind them all perfectly to shape. This one, you just have to shape the handles, shape the scales beforehand. I'm sure a lot of people do that anyway. It's not what I'm used to doing, so I did have to put a little bit of thought into it ahead of time. Now we're going to move to the etching. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the etching on this video. I covered the entire etching on a separate video. I will post a link to it on this one. But basically I'm using a car battery charger. I'm using saltwater solution as the electrolyte. I have a wound wad of gauze on the negative lead from that battery charger, and I'm using templates that are cut from a craft vinyl cutter called a Silhouette Cameo. It's a machine that you get at good craft stores, and that Silhouette Cameo vinyl cutting machine really has brought the etching, or my etching, to a whole different level. I mean, there's just no way that I could have cut out the detail of this etching on vinyl using my little razor knife. This is certainly the most detailed spine work that I've ever done, or spine etching that I've ever done. And this is just a quick layup on with the scales in place as to what it's going to look like. So after the spine etching was done, I wanted to move over onto etching a couple of different things onto the blade of this particular cleaver. I'm going to do a nautical anchor on one side and a sea turtle on the other side. And again, both of these templates were cut out with a vinyl cutting machine, or a cutting machine, craft cutting machine. The one that I bought and used is called the Silhouette Cameo. Very happy with it. So I'm applying that vinyl, self-adhering vinyl template. And then I'm going to go through the etching process, and I usually etch each area of that template for about 10 seconds, and then I move until every area is etched, and then I go back and I do that a total of 2 or 3 times, so that you end up with a nice deep etching. And then afterwards, you basically peel off that vinyl and you clean up the blade with a little alcohol wipe to get rid of some of the glue, and then I repolish it again. This particular one was polished with an 800 grit paper, but check out the detail on that sea turtle. I mean, it just, that vinyl cutter really brought it to a different level. After the etching is done, the next step, and one of the last steps, is going to be to permanently mount the scales. In this case, they are walnut handles, fairly plain handles, because there's enough going on this blade with the etching. I use a 2-part epoxy. I usually mix just a couple of drops of black glue in with that epoxy, and then I clamp it all together with brass pins. I used 1/4-inch diameter brass pins. I clamp that all together and I let it sit overnight until it's completely cured, and then I can do the final work on the scales, and that's just a little bit of sanding away from the spine, and a little bit of sanding and a little bit of smoothing out some of the rough edges. So here the scales are kind of in place. It's really important not to get any of that epoxy onto the etching. The next time I do this, I'll probably put some painter's tape, cut into the exact thickness of the blade, and protect that etching, because it's a real pain in the neck to clean that epoxy off of any etched area. Basically, just like with the bolsters, I'm going to go to a bandsaw and just trim off the excess length on the 1/4-inch brass pins, and then I will go to a belt sander and polish those pins right down until they're flush with the handles. I also used a Dremel grinder just to finish grinding the bottom of the handles and smoothing out the rough edges, and then I did do some hand sanding as well. And of course, being very careful not to sand any of the etchings. But overall, it's a pretty simple knife project. It really gives the beginners and intermediate knife makers the ability to put out a really decent product without having to plunge cut. The bevels, you can add as many embellishments as you want. You could, add different types of pins, different types of handles, micarta handles, hybrid handles, anything you want to enhance the style or design of this particular blade. Let's just check out a few images of the finished product. So we have a nautical themed cleaver, actually to go along with a fish, and I also did a turtle shaped cutting board a while back. Nautical anchor chain engraved or etched into the spine. Anchor and anchor chain on one side of the blade, and a very detailed sea turtle on the other side of the blade. And again, it's all 1095 high carbon steel, 3/16 thick, and available as a waterjet cut blank. Please check us out on the internet, DIYEasyCrafts.com. Be sure to check out our other how-to projects, including quite a few knife making projects. And if you like this video, I ask that you please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you.